Hello everybody, this is Peter Dillard. Welcome to a new episode of Black Cat Theology. It's been a while since I've made any videos, but I feel the need to do so today because I have noticed in recent communication with several people in social media, there are a number of my younger colleagues who would like to know more about metaphysics, and in particular, they would like to know how to become familiar and acquaint themselves with the relevant metaphysical material that might help them to pursue certain theological issues. So what I'd like to do in this video today is give a mini tutorial on that topic. What I'm going to do is just mention several works that I think serve as suitable introductory texts for people who have that objective. And I'll give a few here in just a minute. Now let me preface this by saying that a lot of my work, not all of it, but a lot of it has been done in recent years on theology in a Heideggerian tradition that conceptualizes or thematizes itself as non-metaphysical. Now, just to make a disclaimer here initially, that doesn't necessarily mean that all metaphysics is off the table, because Heidegger uses the notion of the term metaphysics in a very circumscribed way. Briefly, he feels that this metaphysics involves a sort of universal conception of being, or what we might call a uniform conception of being, a maximally general characteristic that in the Western tradition applies to all and only beings. And that this has been interpreted at different points in the Western tradition in different ways. So, for example, according to Heidegger's interpretation, something like the Hegelian notion of absolute spirit counts as a notion of being, an understanding, a metaphysical understanding of being, because all and only beings are conceptualized or conceived under that rubric as instantiations of absolute spirit of something immaterial that grows and develops and comes to self-awareness through history. So that's a very limited notion of metaphysics, and a lot of other things that have traditionally fallen under the category of metaphysics don't really fit into that mold. So what I'm saying here briefly is that someone who is interested both in Heidegger's view but also in other kinds of theology that are more metaphysically oriented could balance those two things with the recognition that for Heidegger, metaphysics has this extremely circumscribed meaning. So with that caveat out of the way, let me just give several examples of texts that some of you who are interested in metaphysics in connection with theology might find a good place to begin. So one that I really like is a book called Universals, an Opinionated Introduction. This may not come up the right way on the screen, but it's by David M. Armstrong. It was published by it's Westview Press is the edition that I have, and that was published in 1989. So this is a really nice introduction to the questions in the theory of universals. So, for example, issues such as whether the universal, like redness, is that a property common to all and only red things, where those things are at least partially identical with each other in virtue of having this general characteristic. There's a real identity that is carried by the universal, redness, and then there are other universals and other examples. Or what is it? Is that what the universal is, or is it simply a similarity relationship among red things? So all we have are these particulars. This is a view called nominalism as opposed to realism, the view that I first described. So according to a nominalist position, roughly, for things to be red is for them to be particulars that resemble each other more than they resemble anything else. They form a resemblance class, and this resemblance, they resemble each other in a particular respect, the red respect. They resemble each other more than they do anything outside the class. So that's a kind of issue that might come up. For example, when people are talking about nominalism in late medieval philosophy and also into the Reformation, as opposed to realism about universals, it might be useful to have this tool in your toolbox as you approach that theological issue. Or when people are talking about Christ's human nature, is that a genuine universal that he shares with all and only human beings? Or is there simply a resemblance relation between Christ, the particular human being, at least that which is hypostatically united with the Word, the second person of the Trinity? There's a resemblance in respect of humanity between Christ, the particular human being, and all and only other human beings, so that they form a resemblance class. So that's one text that I want to mention. Another really fine text that I found helpful is by Roderick Chisholm. This is called Brentano and Intrinsic Value. This is a fairly short text. It's very accessible. It's published by Cambridge University Press, and this edition I have came out in 1986, the paperback edition. So here, Chisholm analyzes the notion of intrinsic value in connection with what he calls organic wholes. What is an organic whole? Well, let me give you an example. Suppose that Roderick feels sorry about the sin that Janet has committed. So Janet's committed a sin, and Roderick feels sorrow about this sin that she's committed. So there's a certain fact that is Roderick's feeling sorrow over Janet's sin. Now, we want to say intuitively that fact is a good thing. It's valuable. It has intrinsic value. But let's look at the various components of it. One is the fact that Janet has committed a sin. That's one constituent of the fact. There's the fact that Roderick considers or is aware of her having committed this sin. And then there's his sorrow over that. Now, Janet's sin is intrinsically bad. Roderick's considering her sin or being aware of it is neutral, and Roderick's feeling sorrow over it, sadness, is also a negative thing. It's not something that's inherently good. And yet the organic whole itself is intrinsically valuable. It's positive, whereas its various components are either indifferent or negative. So the value of the whole cannot be reduced to the values of its constituent parts or components. That's what makes it an organic whole. And very interestingly, in one chapter of this study, Chisholm uses this to develop a theodicy, what's called a greater goods theodicy. The basic idea of a greater goods theodicy is that God permits evil because it allows for greater goods. And Chisholm goes on to explore how this idea might be worked out. And there's several different ways it could be worked out conceivably. But my point is that once again here we have a metaphysical notion, the notion of an organic whole, and the connected or the associated theory of organic wholes, an intrinsic value, which is a metaphysical theory, but it also finds a theological application. So this is another text that I recommend to you because it's very accessible, it's very clear and rigorous, but it's a good place to begin if you're interested in metaphysics and you want to see how it might have positive, be able to make positive contributions to a particular theological issue. Now, another example I want to give, I had a younger colleague on Twitter who was looking for some metaphysical information, some metaphysical sources, and I believe that she's interested in particular in issues of time and eternity and so forth in a theological context. Well, an excellent text to consult in this context is Time, Creation, and the Continuum, Theories in Antiquity and the Early Middle Ages by Richard Sorabji. This was published by the University of Chicago Press in 1988, the paperback version. And this is a fine study. It's philosophically rigorous. It's also historically informed, and it pays sufficient attention to relevant theological issues. In Augustine, for example, his reflections or his meditation on time in the Confessions, it pays attention to the notion of eternity itself, timelessness, and how eternity is different from sort of an infinite temporal duration, arguably, in both directions. Eternity is something other than that. Well, Sorabji devotes considerable attention to those and other issues in this book, so I very highly recommend that to you. Now, those are just some examples that I wanted to give, and to conclude this video, I'd like to mention another case that is relevant or impinges on some work that I'm doing right now. This has to do with the notion of identity. Now, identity is an equivalence relation, at least traditionally. So if X and Y are, everything is identical to itself, so X is self-identical. If X is identical to Y, then Y is identical to X. It's a symmetrical relation, at least traditionally understood. And it's transitive. So if X is equal to Y and Y is equal to Z, then X is equal to Z. That's how it's traditionally understood. But there has been some very fascinating recent work in metaphysics on a sort of non-standard view of identity, where the identity relation is not transitive. In other words, it's possible for X and Y to be identical with something else, Z, even though X and Y with each other are not identical. So this is a very interesting point, at least potentially from a theological perspective, because the persons of the Trinity don't appear to stand in standard traditional identity relations. The Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are all identical with the divine essence, but they're not identical with each other, at least not as persons. So this notion might conceivably find an application in theological studies devoted to the Trinity. Now, a really, really good work to begin to consult when you begin to think about this issue is called One. This is a book by Graham Priest, a philosopher. It was published by Oxford University Press. Recently, it was published in 2014, the paperback version 2016. Now, this is very interesting because Priest goes on to develop what he calls Diolatheism, which is, among other things, involves a non-transitive notion of the identity relation. Priest applies this to explain how parts can come together to form a whole. So if we have a whole consisting of parts X, Y, and Z, Priest argues that X, Y, and Z are all identical with this, what Priest calls a gluon, G, but X, Y, and Z, the parts are not identical with each other. That's the very basic idea that he develops in this extremely fine study. And I find this interesting because it has possible ramifications to some of the research that I'm doing. Now, Priest himself is sympathetic to a Buddhist perspective, and towards the end of the book, he shows how his metaphysical theory dovetails with this version of Buddhism to which he's quite sympathetic. But there are other places in which a dialetheistic or a non-transitive identity relation might prove interesting. And I don't want to get into this too much because it has to do with research that I'm conducting at the present time. But what's interesting to me is that in some of the works by mystical theologians, for example, Hugh of Balma is a Carthusian who wrote towards the end of the 13th century. I want to argue, and I'm not going to get into this too much now, but I want to argue that Hugh of Balma presents certain metaphors that imply or very strongly suggest this kind of diatheistic metaphysics, this kind of non-standard, non-transitive conception of the identity relation that might prove useful and fruitful in elucidating and helping to evaluate his version of mystical theology, which is purely affective. It's not, the mystical union is not achieved primarily through the intellect, according to Hugh. It's achieved through the affective power, through the will, through love. Now, what's interesting about this is that Hugh uses certain metaphors. He uses the metaphor of two things being glued to each other or being bound to one another. And the reason that's interesting is that Graham Priest uses this same kind of metaphor in these same kind of metaphors of adhesion to motivate the particular metaphysics that he develops in this book. So here is an example of where I think we have a potentially fruitful interchange between metaphysics in philosophy and mystical theology in this case, where certain metaphors in an author's writings, in a theologian's writings, even though they do not literally enunciate metaphysical principles, they may imply them. And so if we decrypt the metaphor, so to speak, and cash them out in terms of their underlying metaphysical principles, then we may be better prepared to evaluate the particular metaphysical theology. We have another interesting and potentially quite useful tool in our metaphysical toolbox with which to approach these works. So I commend that to you. Maybe you can think of other authors who utilize metaphors that might be decrypted in a similar metaphysical way with very different results. So I just wanted to give that mini tutorial today. I hope that you'll find it interesting. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to list them in my feed. I may devote some more attention to this material or these kinds of issues in a future video or maybe in future videos. And I definitely would like to come back to mystical theology in a diatheistic vein in the future. But that's enough for now. I just wanted to give you some ideas that you might find useful as you continue to pursue your own work on these topics. So that's all for today. I hope everybody's doing well. Be safe, be well, take care of yourselves. I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving and a blessed Christmas. And until next time, this is Dr. Peter Dillard signing off for Black Cat Theology. Thank you for joining me.